I'm delighted once again to be joined by Cormac Smith. He's worked in public relations and corporate communications for over 3 decades. He's in the absolutely unique position of having traveled to Ukraine to take up a special appointment as the strategic communication advisor to Pavlo Klimkin, then the foreign minister of Ukraine. He was attached to the British embassy in Kyiv and embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That experience is, as I say, absolutely unique and unparalleled, and I am delighted that in this tragic and momentous anniversary week of the fourth anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, that we can have this conversation with someone who has been consistently right about Ukraine, consistently right about Western weakness and mistakes, and consistently fierce and passionate in support of Ukraine, democracy, and civilized values. Cormac, welcome back.
Jonathan, it's always a great pleasure to join you. It's not a particularly pleasurable subject today, but I am hugely grateful for the opportunity that you give for us to remind the world, or the part of it that we can reach, of what has been going on for the last 4 years.
This phrase popped up this week. I won't say who used it because this individual I know them to be very well meaning and very well informed about Ukraine, but unfortunately their choice of words was not good. They used the word "we're with Ukraine as long as it takes." Now, in the first year of war, it seemed to me that that phrase didn't necessarily grate on our ears because we perhaps didn't necessarily really had a sense of the weakness of the West and the weakness of the West's response, and actually the culpability we hold in not stopping the invasion from happening, not deterring the aggression from Putin. But now in the fourth year of war, that phrase feels incredibly toxic. As long as it takes, long as it takes for what? It suggests to me that we still don't have a plan. We don't have a plan on how to deal with Putin, how to force him to stop. We don't have any idea of how to make him stop. Well, a few of the experts do, but they're not being listened to. There is a complete lack of any planning for outcomes, except Ukraine, of course. But they are still, without full-throated Western support, they are still in a form of survival mode. What's your thoughts about this as long as it takes vibe?
Jonathan, the phrase "as long as it takes" has been grating on my nerves for the best part of 4 years, I'm afraid. What we needed to say from the start is we are with Ukraine until they win. That is the only thing we should have been saying. I remind you of a soundbite which I coined myself, which was "arm Ukraine to the teeth and sanction Russia back to the Stone Age." Now, I started saying this about a month before the full-scale invasion went in this day 4 years ago. And I have got to say that had we done that from the beginning, this war would likely be over now, and it would likely be over in the favor of Ukraine. In fact, I believe it could have been over in late 2022. We have always slow walked aid to Ukraine. We have given them too little, too slowly, and we have then tended to give them weapons with handcuffs on. Famously, they could not use our medium and long range missiles to strike Russian military targets inside Russia, from where genocidal and murderous attacks on Ukrainian civilian targets were being launched. Initially we looked for modern battle tanks, we looked for ATACMS, multiple launch rocket systems, and we looked for other long range artillery, and we looked for modern fighter jets. And in nearly all three cases, I've got to say, Britain was instrumental in breaking the logjam. First, with the modern battle tanks. Yes, we only gave them 14 Challengers, but that freed up the Americans to give them, I think it was 31 Abrams, and finally the Germans gave them the very tank that they needed, which was the Leopard. It was again later on that same year that the Brits were the first ones to give them long-range artillery with Storm Shadow. The Germans still have not given them Taurus. And of course, it took years for them to be given F-16s. So this has, and of course, the most recent debacle that we have had was earlier on last year, Trump talking about um, donating tomahawks. That frightened the absolute shit out of Putin. And as soon as that was on the table, he wanted to have negotiations. But of course, as you and I knew, Trump withdrew that offer very, very quickly. So, yes, I am absolutely sick of hearing the phrase for as long as it takes. We should be with Ukraine to ensure victory and to ensure victory as quickly and efficiently as we can. And if I can, before I finish, if I, there's one former US general who I love quoting, and that's former General Wesley Clark, who was the supreme commander of NATO in his day. And Wesley Clark said at a security conference in Kyiv in the summer of 2022, he said three things which I will always remember. He said, give Ukraine every weapon that they need, including A-10s and F-16s, the A-10 being the famous Warthog, the tank buster. He said, give Putin no off-ramp. We were talking at the time in the exact opposite way of looking for an off-ramp for Putin. And finally, he said, do not be intimidated by his nuclear threats. I was out in The Hague, and in fact, it was the year before last, visiting a very good friend of mine who is a senior diplomat in the Ukrainian embassy in The Hague. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time had counted over 120 times when Putin had rattled the nuclear saber. And every time we either backed off or we slow walked what we were doing considerably, always to Ukraine's disadvantage, always at the cost of Ukrainian blood and lives, and always to the advantage of Vladimir Putin. I think I've made my point. It absolutely boils my blood to hear the phrase for as long as it takes. It's meaningless.
Exactly. Whatever it takes to achieve victory, aligning with outcomes. I think Ben Hodges made that point to me in autumn 2022 that we do not have a strategy for dealing with the collapse of Russia, and yet so much of our actions seems to be designed to prevent Russia from collapsing. That seems to be the number one objective, with Ukraine's survival being the number two, and victory nowhere in sight on that list, or even considered necessarily a desirable thing because it conflicts with the number one choice, which is preventing Russia from collapsing or using nuclear weapons, which, as you say, is this extraordinary blackmail. What have you learned from this 4 years? I mean, you were already more intimately aware of Ukrainian values, Ukrainian life, Ukrainian civilization, than most people were, including myself. I knew a lot about Russia. I knew relatively little about Ukraine 4 years ago. What has this 4 years taught you about Ukraine? What has it actually taught you about the society you come from, Western democracy and its state of health or lack of it?
Well, look, what has it taught me about Ukraine first and foremost? I was at the end of an interview about 4 years ago today, if not a little bit longer. I was on with Nick Ferrari on LBC. And at the end of the interview, he said, Cormac, you've lived among Ukrainians. What would you say about them as a people? And I said that they were some of the kindest, warmest, most welcoming people that I had ever come across, but yet they were absolutely resilient. And I use the term hard as nails. Now, I think what I have seen from the Ukrainians in the last 4 years, including my friends in civil society, my friends in government, and people I know who have fought on the front line, has exceeded even my expectation about their absolute resilience and courage as a nation. And That's their government from Zelensky down to their diplomats to their heroic armed forces and the ordinary Ukrainian people. You know, it was the great Prussian statistician of the 19th century, Karl von Clausewitz, who said, to win at war, you need three elements in perfect harmony. You need your government, you need your army, and you need your people. Ukraine has got that, and it's the lesson that Ukraine is there to teach us, and they are there to teach us about integrity and courage. The second part of your question is, what have I learned about our own society? I have been consistently disappointed and let down by what I have seen as a lack of moral fiber, a lack of backbone or courage, and a lack of integrity and honesty, and an absolute denial that this, you know, you've heard my sound bites, this wolf will come to our door. It's our money and guns today or our daughters and sons tomorrow. I sit at home and my partner, who would be less political than I am, has been saying in the last 6 months to a year, but Cormac, you've been saying this for 2 years, 3 years, you've been saying this for 4 years. And I'm just a little guy, Jonathan. I'm a little guy who went out. I had a career in government communications. I had a life-changing experience, not just a great professional experience, but something that was life-changing when I went out and got the great opportunity to work at the heart of the Ukrainian government for 2 years and meet people at every level, not just in government, but in across Ukrainian society, and make friends for life, and learn about a country that valued something that we in the West have lost. And what I found out back in 2016 was that Ukrainians valued freedom. They understood what freedom really was. They understood that there was a price to freedom. And as we were learning then, they were willing to pay that price. But as we have learned in the last 4 years, freedom is not free. We don't seem to be willing to pay the price for freedom at the moment, deluding ourselves that this wolf will not come to our door. Well, I've got news for you. The wolf is not at our door anymore. The wolf is in our house, and it's going through our underwear drawer, and it's sniffing around, and it's messing with our electrics and all of our other belongings. And we seem to delude ourselves. In the UK, we have a situation where, quite frankly, and despite all the fine talk, our government is not being honest with us about spending on defence. A small group, which you'll be aware of, Defence on the Brink, which I am a part of, along with Colonel Philip Ingram, another colonel, and two very fine journalists. We exist pro bono to lobby the British government to increase defence spending. And we wrote to the Prime Minister last week. You may have seen it. We got front page on the Mail, and our letter was covered in the Times and the Telegraph again. And we have, in fact, Boris Johnson is the most recent person who has agreed to sign up to our letter. But the main point that we say is, look, we are a long, long way off the 5% that we need to be spending. This is not going to be done by rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. There is going to be some very, very difficult decisions to be made around the big departments of health and social welfare and education. But quite frankly, we need to get back to the basic truth that the first job of any government is the defense of the realm and the defense of the people. Because if we don't get that right, we will not have education systems and health systems and welfare systems to worry about. So, you know, the British people, and I would suggest people in other countries in Europe, but the British people is what I'm concerned with, are a long way off still understanding exactly where we are. There needs to be a grown-up conversation, and our government must lead that conversation. This was one of the points that we made very, very clearly in our letter to Keir Starmer last week, which, by the way, was signed up to by over 30 of the most senior leaders in politics and military of the last couple of decades in this country. So, have a look at the letter if you haven't seen it. What more, what more do we need to be told than to say, we are in trouble? If I can say one more thing, I often think, back in 2017, when I was with the Ukrainians, when I was working for the Ukrainian government, I traveled to a security conference in Halifax in Canada. And during a press conference, Pavlo Klimkin, who was the foreign minister of Ukraine that I was there to advise at the time, there was debate on were we in a new Cold War? And Pavlo told, this was 9 years ago, Pavlo told the world's media and anybody at that conference who would listen that no, we were not in a new Cold War. We were already in a hot war. Russia knew it. We did not. And the one thing that we have failed to grasp is the nature of Russian hybrid, or sometimes called gray zone warfare. And it's not necessarily going to be Russian tanks driving down the mall, but there are so many other hybrid ways that our society can be disrupted, damaged, and our way of life damaged hugely at a very significant cost to us. And we seem to be waking up to this very, very late. Yes, some of our senior leaders, like the couple of weeks ago or a month ago, the current head, Blaise Metrovelli, I think, fabulous name, of MI6, came out and said as much. We have many senior leaders now saying this, but our politicians are not getting on board. It's former leaders who are saying it. So, we need to be having this grown up conversation with the British people, because if we're to defend our way of life, which is on life support at the moment, because, last year saw Donald Trump deal a death blow to what we have known as the rules based order, imperfect as it was. And we now look to the European Union, other countries like Britain who are part of Europe but not part of the European Union, Canada, other friends, Australia, New Zealand, hopefully Japan and maybe South Korea. We look at those group of friends now, medium-sized countries, to come together, countries that have a common interest in democracy. Because remember, even last year, even before Trump started, the Economist, let me get the title right, the Economist Research Group, I think, does an annual audit of democracy. And last year, according to that annual audit, less than 7% of the world's population lived under full democracy. Now, I've got to tell you, according to that, America was a flawed democracy. How will that audit mark America after the year that Donald Trump has had in the White House? So, the values of freedom and democracy that we have unfortunately have taken for granted, they are very much in peril at the moment.
Absolutely. Weaker than we would like, weaker than many believe, unfortunately. I wanted to pick up on that point you made about the war that Russia is going to opt to confront us with is not necessarily the one we're expecting. It's not going to be taking a chunk out of Estonia or taking over Narva. You see this scenario in many of the more, let's say, standard sort of, traditional military kind of things. This is what they're going to do. They're going to crash NATO by, taking some swamps. Near northern Russia. I mean, this is not, it seems to me, what they're aiming for at this point. They're aiming for something far, far bigger. and far more insidious, which is to combine hybrid operations you've talked about, to combine political operations, to combine psychological warfare and informational warfare to destabilize the very foundations of our democracies. Yes, but to make us doubt that there is such a thing as democracy, make us doubt there is such a thing as morality, there's such a thing that's worth fighting for. And in some ways, to flip states into either electing or being toppled by Russian puppets. I think this is where it is likely to head. I do you agree this is a risk? And how unprepared are we for this style of multi-level hybrid war at scale?
I did a small podcast. I think it was the first week in December last year, where I said about 5 weeks before Mark Carney used the phrase at Davos, I said, in relation to Europe, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Now, I said that in relation to the United States National Security Strategy, which had just been published. And in this strategy, it talks about, in their view, and we've heard J.D. Vance telling us that, we have no free speech, et cetera, in Europe. In this document, it talked about civilizational decline in Europe, and it said that the American government would work with what it termed patriotic parties. For patriotic parties, read far right, read Farage in the UK, read Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, read Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, read Orban in Hungary, and other far right populist parties where they exist. It is no surprise that in nearly all cases, these far right populist parties are pro-Putin and would be opposed to government spending on defense. So it's very, very clear. It was set out, the vision of a new world order was set out in that national security strategy at the beginning of December. And in its vision, what it saw was a new world of great powers, which would be the United States, Russia, and China. Why anybody thinks Russia should be considered a great power? They have an economy smaller than that of Italy. And in secondary aspiration, I think they looked at possibly having India and even Japan as five nations. And they envisage this new world order or this group as replacing the G7. Now, I said at the time that it was very, very clear that on the one hand, while they were saying they would work with their patriotic parties across Europe, and we have since had the announcement that they will fund think tanks to across Europe to facilitate this. But it was very, very clear there was no place at this top table for Europe or the European Union or any single European country. So the lesson from this is we are in a different world. And even if Donald Trump disappears tomorrow or next month, the United States, I think, is simply not going to rebound back to the leader of the free world that we have come to take for granted. I said in another podcast more recently for our own channel On the Brink, we need to pull ourselves off the American tit, and we need to do it very, very fast, because America under Donald Trump is no longer our ally or our friend. They have proven they are our enemy. Donald Trump is as I said in an interview earlier on today, Donald Trump is the only one keeping Vladimir Putin in the game in Ukraine at the moment. Russia is losing more troops every month than it can recruit. And I always say in the month of December alone, Russia lost twice as many troops as the USSR lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. This is not sustainable, but Putin is looking for Trump to bail him out. We can guess now, I think, fairly accurately at what was discussed in that summit in Anchorage. And that would appear now to be where the genesis of this absolute capitulation deal, where Ukraine is expected not just to accept the lines are frozen on the current lines of contact, but they give up the additional 20% of the Donetsk region in the Donbass, which Russia, remember, has not been able to capture in not 4 years, in 12 years of fighting. And to remind any of our viewers, that is the heavily fortified fortress belt. It was Alexander Stubb, the Prime Minister of Finland, who said before Christmas, quite simply, that belt is the gateway to Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine. So, no, of course, Ukraine cannot give that up. But you and I know how much they are being pressured to do that. But it is existential. They won't do it. And that's the reason why, on a number of occasions already today, with much regret, I have said that I thought we could quite possibly be talking about this war this time next year, because, and I always quote my great friend Oleksiy Mikheyev, now Ukraine's ambassador in Berlin, who said to me in a private conversation in the first few weeks of the full-scale invasion, he said, Cormac, it's very simple. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. Now, you know, and I know that the Ukrainian people understand this, and certainly all of my friends from whatever background they're from. Yes, they're tired. Yes, they're worn out. Yes, they are hurting. But you know, whoever I speak to, I don't see their determination to keep fighting and to keep their nation alive and to keep their freedom. I don't see that dimmed one iota.
That's the real concern, is whether faced with extreme duress, whether there is a generation in the West who would, you know, run to the fight in the way that many Ukrainians have done. I mean, that's an open question and a disturbing one. Um, the bit I want to end in is what needs to change, because to recap, what we've discussed here and on other occasions, it seems to me that the US has done everything it can to extend the war, whether it intended to or not. That's been the net effect of their intrusion into the process, especially under Trump. Um, Trying to prevent Russia from collapsing under Biden by dribbling supplies to Ukraine, again, has extended the war, the suffering. Ironically, it has made Ukraine stronger in some ways, technologically stronger, more independent. It has helped to build its what is going to be a fearsome military-industrial complex that is going to be the shield and sword of Europe. So ironically, our inaction has helped to force Ukrainians to do that. But are we still getting the fundamentals wrong? That Putin ultimately, this is a war to preserve his regime. It's what Garry Kasparov says. It's what several other people like Khodorkovsky say. He is only interested in keeping his ill-gotten gains, staying alive, and staying in power. And we have not done anything that makes the war in Ukraine an existential threat to his power base. Rather, we have allowed the war to become a crutch which is supporting and preserving his regime. Would you agree? And how do we change that dynamic if you do?
Jonathan, I've been banging my head against it feels like a stone wall for over 4 years. I sat down with the same Ukrainian diplomat friend that I just mentioned around the same time, and I said, let's identify what are the five biggest lies which Russia tells about the reasons why they invaded Ukraine. And of course, there was expansion of NATO, there was Maidan being a US-backed coup, there was Ukraine being full of Nazis, there was Donbass being a civil war, and there was genocide against the Russian-speaking minority. Now, we know that they are all absolutely groundless. We still hear, if not all, we still hear many of those. I started explaining in interviews to anybody who would listen that there were two and two reasons only why Putin invaded Ukraine. One, Ukraine in the Soviet Union was one of 15 Soviet socialist republics. They accounted for as much as 40% of industrial output. They had all the rocket scientists. They had the great wealth of the breadbasket. They had the great mineral wealth of the Donbass region. So first, one, Putin wanted Ukraine, and of course, Putin told us that he thought that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, greater than two world wars, greater than the Holodomor, greater than the Holocaust. It was the breakup of the Soviet Union. So he's told us very clearly that he wants to reverse that. But the other reason was the straw that broke the camel's back with Putin was Maidan, because I will never forget a conference I was at in 2018 in Vilnius, and a Lithuanian political scientist who made a presentation. And I will never forget his words when he described the Kremlin regime as a kleptocratic regime based on mafia and KGB principles. Now, the greatest threat to the existence of that mafia regime, and with it the wealth of Putin and a small number of his cronies, is a thriving, democratic, successful Ukraine on the doorstep. So when you had the revolution of dignity between the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, where the Ukrainian people spontaneously rose up and overthrew a corrupt, cruel, pro-Moscow dictator in Yanukovych, who later had to flee to Russia, presumably where he still resides, taking a lot of his ill-gotten gains with him. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Very soon after that, we had the illegal attempted annexation of Crimea, and we had the invasion of Donbass. But I'd go back even further. When I was in Ukraine, I had the great honor to befriend the Yushchenkos, Katerina and Victor. Victor, of course, who the Russians tried to kill with dioxin back in 2005, was it? And Katerina said to me one day, shortly after the full-scale invasion, she said, Cormac, the first shot in this war was fired the day they tried to murder my husband. Because Victor, the author of the Orange Revolution, was where another election was stolen, and they managed to overturn that. Victor was probably the first Ukrainian leader who put his hand up and said, I am going to take the Ukrainian people where they want to go. And as a very good Ukrainian friend said to me in the office late one night, he said, Cormac, what you have got to realize is it's not that we want the wealth and the affluence of the West. It's what we want to get away from.
That is super important. It's a theme that's come up again and again. Things like the rule of law, volia, agency, dignity, all these sort of words that sort of go to the multifaceted thing that Ukrainians are fighting for, not just to become wealthy and live in Western luxury, but to preserve core political, cultural values that define them as a nation, values which I think we've agreed on multiple occasions we need to relearn and get reacquainted with if we're going to protect our societies. But Cormac, thank you so much for coming back on. It is a heartbreaking anniversary to have this conversation on, but I'm so glad there are people like you who are still talking in such a clear, unequivocal, and passionate way about this topic. Thank you.
And Jonathan, thank you very much as well for all the work you do to keep the light burning.